Let's break down my 5 players that are set to go absolutely nuclear here in week 7 of the fantasy season. These are the players with amazing matchups, extreme upside, and the players that ultimately you cannot afford to bench if you want to dominate your league mates here in week 7 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick the video off with Quinshon Judkins of the Cleveland Browns, coming off of a very disappointing game against the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 6. 12 touches, 36 yards on the ground, and that was it. He had a target, but 0 catches. Before that game, he was on fire with 10 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games and a ceiling of 21.5 fantasy points. We also saw a little bit less volume in that week 6 matchup, and we saw an immense amount of volume in the passing game for the Browns with 52 passing attempts out of rookie quarterback Dylan Gabriel. But here, I think things are going to be a bit different at home, hosting the Miami Dolphins, who have one of the very worst run defenses in the NFL. They have just been giving up game after game, huge game after huge game, to really any running back that faces them. And ultimately, they have allowed the most rushing yards of any team in the league by almost 100 rushing yards, 806 total rushing yards allowed on the season. The next highest team would be the Cincinnati Bengals, who've allowed a total of 718 total rushing yards. So you gotta like this matchup for a great bounce back spot for Quinshon Judkins. Once again, the volume was absolutely immense the previous 3 weeks. The game script kind of impacted things this past week. The Browns felt like they needed to throw the football a ton. I think that's definitely going to change. They're going to lean on the run game. And Quinshon Judkins here in week 7, if you guys own him, he's still averaging double-digit fantasy points per game on the season. You got to feel very good. This matchup is as good as it's going to get. Quinshon Judkins is an absolute must-start running back here in week 7 of the fantasy season. And you may have guessed it, but I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Quinshon Judkins' total rushing yards, currently sitting at 84.5 rushing yards. I think he's going to absolutely smash this against the Dolphins. It's a relatively high line. You could also go for a rushing touchdown scored here by Judkins if you like that better. But ultimately, you gotta love this matchup against the Miami Dolphins. And don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards Week 7 NFL action. Take that free Pick Em. Take Judkins to score a touchdown. If both of those lines hit, you will automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog's also going to give you $50 in bonus cash when you play through $5 on Underdog if you sign up using that promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. And on top of that, they're going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH. Link is down below if you guys want to take advantage of all of Underdog's Week 7 exclusive NFL offers. Next up, we have Javonte Williams of the Dallas Cowboys, also coming off of a disappointing week 6 against the Carolina Panthers. Just 8.4 fantasy points for him, 13 rushes, 29 rushing yards. Did have 8 targets, 5 catches, but just 5 receiving yards. This was the worst performance easily of Javonte Williams here in the 2025 season. But I think week 7, once again, we got a nice bounce back spot against the Washington Commanders, who have moved back in their overall rankings against the running back position, now 18th in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs after giving up a really big performance to DeAndre Swift on Monday Night Football. He just had 25.5 total fantasy points against this Washington Commanders unit, 108 yards on the ground, 7.7 yards per carry, 2 catches, 67 receiving yards, broke one of those for a long touchdown. So DeAndre Swift was able to perform. I think that Javonte Williams is going to come through for you guys here in week 7 of the season at home. And, these divisional matchups can always be, a little bit weird, but ultimately I think when the Cowboys and the Commanders play, we always get a good offensive day of football. And I think that's going to happen here in week 7 of the season. I think really the Cowboys are showing that they're going to be firing on all cylinders offensively, but I think that the run game is going to get back in the mix here in week 7. And I'm not too worried about game script here. I think that Javonte is going to be in line for a solid amount of touches. And once again, I mean, on the season, the Commanders have been pretty good against the run, but they've started to fall back a bit. They have only allowed 4 total touchdowns to running backs on the season as a whole, but I just think this is a get-right spot for Javonte Williams, who had 12 or more fantasy points in the first 5 games of the season, and in that stretch, 19 or more fantasy points in every game except for one. I think he's a lock for double digits, still averaging 18.7 fantasy points per game here on the season. I think he bounces back in a good get-right spot here in a good divisional spot. This is a game where you guys absolutely need to make sure Javonte Williams is in your starting lineup. Let's move to the wide receiver position. I want to start with Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Once again, we have a player coming off of a poor performance in week 6, just 2.7 fantasy points and a very low scoring affair against the Jets, against Sauce Gardner, 3 targets, 1 catch, 17 receiving yards. That was it for Sutton in week 6 of the season, but we had a great spot for Courtland Sutton to get right here in week 7 and absolutely explode at home against the New York Giants, one of the very worst teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. So you have to feel ecstatic if you guys own Courtland Sutton. This is a entirely get right spot, as the Giants have allowed the most receiving yards on the season of any team to opposing wide receivers, with over 1,000 receiving yards already allowed on the season. The only other team in that range is the Dallas Cowboys. These are the only 2 teams who've allowed at least 1,000 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers on the season. So you got to feel good about Courtland Sutton here. You got to feel like the Broncos here at home are going to bounce back, show off some of this offense that is there. It feels like we have weeks where it kind of disappears and Bo Nix plays at a lower ceiling, but this feels like one of those games where they're going to get right. And I really like J.K. Dobbins in this matchup as well. He's in a great spot here, as his Giants defense is also really poor against the run. So I know the Broncos offense coming off of a poor performance in week 7, but you got to feel good if you own these Broncos primary starters in fantasy. They're all, in my opinion, must starts here in week 7, but the player that I would absolutely refuse to bench under any circumstance here in week 7 of the season is Courtland Sutton. He is due for a huge bounce back game. And just don't forget, outside of week 2 and week 6, where he has disappeared with just 1 catch in each of those games, every other game of the season, he's had 17.9 or more fantasy points, 3 touchdowns on the season as well. Sutton in a great spot, a must-start player. You could go nuclear here in week 7. All right, next up, I want to take a look at Ladd McConkey of the LA Chargers, the first player on the list today, who's coming off of a big game, his best fantasy performance of the season so far in week 6 against the Miami Dolphins, had 23 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 catches, 100 receiving yards, and a touchdown. This was his first game on the year with at least 100 receiving yards, and his second game of the year with a touchdown. He now has a touchdown in 2 straight games, and this is a great matchup against the Indianapolis Colts. They have been struggling heavily against the wide receiver position. They're not a bad defense, but they give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, bottom 5 against wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. And we just talked about, the teams that have given up at least 1,000 receiving yards on the season to opposing wide receivers. The Colts are barely under, with 973 receiving yards allowed to opposing wide receivers. So you look at things here ultimately, right? We might get Quentin Johnston back this week. He has missed the past week. Then we still got Keenan Allen looming around. Oriande Gadsden, the tight end position, has been making some waves as well in terms of the volume in this passing game. And then Kamani Vidal starting to get going. He did have 4 targets this past week at the running back position. So there are a lot of potential weapons here for Justin Herbert, who is still dealing with some offensive lineman injuries, but that didn't seem to impact them too much in week 6 like it impacted them in week 5. But nonetheless, through the past 2 weeks, Ladd McConkey has been okay overall with 14.9 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. So his overall volume could be impacted here. He's had at least 7 targets in the last 2 games, but it does kind of feel like Ladd McConkey is slowly but surely starting to reestablish establish himself as the true number one pass catcher in this offense. So I think even if Quentin Johnston plays this week, like I think every Chargers wide receiver is very startable this week, but I think Ladd McConkey is going to come through as the dominant wide receiver one for the LA Chargers once again here in week 7. Home game. This is a big game for both teams. I think overall this is going to be a good matchup with a good amount of points scored. So I feel good here. You guys own Ladd McConkey. Don't overthink it. QJ's coming back. I know it's been a bit inconsistent for Ladd McConkey. Chargers have injuries across the board, but I really believe that Ladd McConkey is going to build upon what he's done the last 2 weeks in fantasy, have another really good performance here in week 7 of the season. All right, last but not least, I'm going to talk about a tight end, and that is rookie Mason Taylor of the New York Jets. And this one might have some of you guys feeling a little bit queasy, but you gotta love this matchup. The Panthers have given up the second most fantasy points to opposing tight ends on the season. They have been one of the teams that if you own the tight end going up against the Panthers, we want to start them on a week-to-week basis. The Panthers, the Bengals, these are the two teams we are looking to stream tight ends against and that give us absolute must-start tight ends on a week-to-week basis. But a couple things that are very important here. Obviously, we have the injury to Garrett Wilson for the Jets. He is doubtful to play this week, although technically speaking, he has not been ruled out just yet. And obviously, we're coming off of a game where the Jets just looked absolutely abysmal across the board offensively. A total of 45 passing yards from Justin Fields this past week probably doesn't have you feeling great, but don't forget in week 2 he had 27 passing yards, was somehow worse, and then in his next 2 starts had at least 226 passing yards. So yeah, don't get me wrong, guys, I'm as worried as the next guy in terms of this Jets offense just turning completely anemic, but this is a home game. I do think the Panthers defense a little bit underrated, but what we do know is that they are awful against the tight end position, and most importantly, awful in terms of receiving yards allowed. They've allowed the most receiving yards of any team in the league to opposing tight ends with 444 total receiving yards allowed. That is absolutely abysmal, okay? So while they are a little bit better, I guess you could say, against opposing tight ends in terms of touchdowns allowed, they're still tied for the 3rd most touchdowns allowed on the season. And that receiving yard total is really important here because I think even if the Jets offense is somewhat struggling, they got to throw the football to somebody. And right now, this wide receiver core is Josh Reynolds and a bunch of players that you would never even imagine starting from a fantasy capacity. Half of them you probably have never even heard of. And I think that Mason Taylor is going to benefit from that, get a ton of targets in this game. Don't forget he had 6 or more targets in 3 straight games before last week's matchup against a very good Denver Broncos defense. I think he could easily get 10 plus targets in this week 7 matchup, make the most of it, and come out with a very solid fantasy performance like we saw in week 5 against the Cowboys with 17.7 fantasy points. I truly believe Mason Taylor will easily hit 15 plus fantasy points in full PPR here in week 7 of the season. It's a great matchup. It's a get right spot for the Jets. I mean, it's not going to be hard to do better than what they did this past week against the Broncos, but still, you got to feel good here if you own Mason Taylor. Ignore everything else going on with this Jets team and just hone in on the fact that this matchup is incredible, especially even if he doesn't score a touchdown, which he hasn't done on the season, the overall potential for targets, receptions, and receiving yards in this matchup is there for Mason Taylor. I think he could absolutely explode here in week 7. There you guys have it. There are my 5 players set to go absolutely nuclear here in week 7 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below, so make sure you guys drop all your fantasy questions. I will answer as many as I can throughout the week. If you guys need anything at all, please let me know as we approach the weekend. And while you guys are down there, it helps out the channel tremendously. It does me a huge favor if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. When the playlists and videos pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 7 fantasy content. We have everything you could possibly need here on the channel to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So make sure you guys are checking out the videos as they drop. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.